You're listening to Classic Dialogues, Land Power in the Indo-Pacific, a China Land Power Study Center production. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and are not necessarily those of the Department of the Army, the U.S. Army War College, or any other agency of the U.S. government. I'm in the studio today with Colonel Richard Butler, Director of the China Land Power Study Center at the U.S. Army War College, and Army Colonel, Assistant Chief of Staff, G5, U.S. Army Pacific, Marco Lyons. Lyons is the author of War with China, A View from 2024, which was published by the China Land Power Study Center in April of 2024. Over to you, Colonel Butler.
Marco, welcome to the show. Glad to have you here from Hawaii.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Looking forward to the discussion today about your article. It's absolutely fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to write the essay? Because it's an update from an older essay written by another esteemed author.
The background's actually pretty easy and it's pretty straightforward insofar as being G5 Chief of Plans out at United States Army Pacific. I wanted to make sure I was not missing the best work that's been done over the last really 40 to 50 years with respect to the Indo-Pacific and China as a potential adversary. So I came across the 2012 article by Dobbins, War with China, when I was done reading it the first time. It was an eye-opener, and I immediately knew this was a unique article because from the 2012 vantage point, I thought he really was looking into the future. So in that respect, the article was ahead of its time. Now, about the article itself, he is exploring how we would get into a war with China. At that time, he stresses not particularly likely. So for me, when I thought about the article, I thought how much things have changed in one decade. I don't think that it is nearly as unlikely as he thought. Again, just 12 years ago, things have really changed. China has changed. And that's the real thing about doing an update article, is really highlighting the change over those years. Like General Flynn has said, these changes are historic. The changes with China, their modernization, as well as the changes in the theater, driven not exclusively, but to an extensive degree by China's actions and China's security and defense-related choices and developments. The article, it was one of those situations where when I was done reading it the first time, I immediately saw in my mind the update. And so I wanted to capture it for my own records, and then it looked like something that could help current debates.
First of all, thank you for taking the time to share it with us and the audience, because I think it adds some depth and helps reconcile some of the cognitive understanding of why do we care about China's rise and how they rise. Since you're a war planner at heart, as well as one of the best strategists in the Army, what do you think is the most likely scenario for a war between the United States and China?
Yeah, Rich, thank you for that question. And by the way, I want to make sure that I say here and now that the China Land Power Study Center is incredibly, incredibly important to the Army and incredibly important to everything that the United States Army Pacific is doing. So thank you for all of that. And I hope that the article does fit well with the CLSC's presentation. I'll start with how important it is that we focus on possible scenarios. Starting really several years ago, General Flynn has prodded me to look at very different, varied scenarios for how we could find ourselves in a war with China. So we're talking about a war that is focused on Central Asia, a war that's focused, of course, on the subcontinent and the border with India, war that is really prompted by developments in Southeast Asia, and then all the way around to a second Korean War. The scenarios are varied. We really do need to look at them. And we need to pay a lot more attention. Again, I'll say we need to devote a lot more wargaming and experimentation and studies focused to possible scenarios, varied scenarios. That's where I think the CLSC can come in and be incredibly valuable. Now, to the scenarios themselves. The interesting thing, and I think the updated War with China article brings this out, the scenarios are linked in many ways that we need to, of course, be very careful about. In other words, we need to plan for multiple scenarios to be, I still haven't found the right word, ignited or prompted or scenarios enacted as a grouping. So there is talk about sympathetic detonation, which is a great imagery for how these scenarios could ignite each other in some type of series. And really a series of any two or more of these scenarios would mean that we're probably headed for major conflict, major war, major operations.
Yeah, it brings back the term general war.
Yes, it does.
which is a unsatisfying thought for most of us.
Yes. Rich, thank you for bringing that up, because that is another one of my talking points that I have ready to go is the return of general war. Because again, with my studies before 1991 and before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, military professionals and our Army leaders, our Army 3- and 4-star generals talked and they wrote often in terms of general war. General war was the standard insofar as there was any standard, but of course they also looked at nuclear war and irregular wars. But general war involving a major power or a great power on both sides was the bread and butter. So they talked and they wrote a lot about general war. It was part of the regular lexicon. After 1991, general war virtually disappears overnight. And so we are back into an era of general war, and we need to quickly reacquaint ourselves with that. So a general war, and this is a good way to tie it back to scenarios, would be multiple scenarios interlocked and interrelated. And our plans and our policy and our strategies need to reflect that.
As I think back over strategy and planning, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, since the pivot began in 2011, we used to view the DPRK and its military, the Chinese and its military, and the Russians and its military as distinct nation states, distinct organizations. But I believe that as we've been better at integrating ourselves, and you watch things like authoritarian collusion going on in the Ukraine and how the ties go through Iran and into the Houthi areas and into Lebanon and Gaza, that we're in a much more complicated or complex environment where the idea that you're going to have vertical and horizontal escalation and simultaneity problems are much more real than false. To your point about general war, I think that's a direction we've got to go, because the interests, the vital interests of the United States are so much at stake, as well as those of our allies and partners, because of the global integration. It's historically somewhat like before World War I. It's somewhat like the Cold War, but it's something we have not seen or grappled with as a society since, frankly, you and I were kids, and we're not that young anymore. So if we isolate it and just talk about China for a couple of reasons, number one is we're talking about something related to the China Land Power Study Center. And number two is because China is the economic and military power that has the wherewithal to carry much, much further into the century as the standard bearer of authoritarian nations and the design that they've got to bend the will of the international order to the Belt and Road Initiative, which isn't all bad, but there's certain key aspects fundamentally flawed and counter to the order that we set up after World War II as the United Nations, essentially. What are the ways that we can responsibly push back against China without unnecessarily spurring conflict?
This question is getting deserved attention right now. I'm not sure the framing is right, though. Pushing back almost implies that we question whether we have a standing. I think pushback is also a term that reflects a thinking that is still grounded in the China is a budding economic partner, is a diplomatic almost friend. Not to sound too gloomy here, of course, but these are the ideas that reflect a bygone era. So pushback against China, or is it how do we assert our interests responsibly, and how do we assert our interests, remembering, of course, that especially in this region, our interests are always bilateral and multilateral. So it's never U.S. interests alone in this region. So how do we responsibly pursue our interests while preparing for the possibility that it will lead to conflict, even conflict short of war? And I think that the administration, for example, leaders in the Department of Defense and other parts of the interagency and the administration today who understand this and are moving out on this. I'm encouraged by the national strategic and policy level direction towards managing the China challenge. Okay, but back down to the military level, it's still our responsibility, United States Army Pacific and the other service components under the leadership of the commander of Indo-PACOM to provide executable options to the national security, national strategic authority, given all the possibilities in the theater. So pushback, of course, we're concerned. We should always be concerned about escalation, certainly against another great power. But I would turn it around and say, we have a strategic responsibility. Frankly, we have a national responsibility with the American people to pursue U.S. and friendly interests. And we're in the region. We're already in the game. It's not like we're deciding to enter the game. General Flynn talks about the infinite game and constantly brings us back to this mental framing. So it's what we understand we're doing day in and day out. Even in terms of unwanted escalation, we will still plan in terms of tamping down unintended escalation.
If we stay centered on the M in the dime and focus a little bit on your role as the G5 at U.S. Army Pacific, responsible for campaigning, strategy, plans, and wargaming, one of my favorite things. What's the Army's role in deterrence of Chinese aggression in the region?
Yes, incredibly important. So first of all, as far back as late 2021, the Secretary laid out a complete vision for the role of land power in the Indo-Pacific. It is what we expect. It is sustainment. It is forward presence. It is C2. It is air and missile defense. But it also includes the capabilities and, frankly, capacity as well to conduct counter land control operations. That is to retake territory that is friendly to us through allies and partners, providing those capabilities to retake territory that we need to restore to friendly control. Friendly, of course, for me is always in terms of a coalition under a combined headquarters. So the role of land power, the Secretary's laid it out. The Army has a clear vision for this. It's now up to us and it's up to the Army as an enterprise to move out on this. It's no surprise that the role of the Army for the Joint Force Commander in this region is about integrating operational warfighting functions. There's no surprise there. The Secretary did, frankly, a historic job refocusing us on this role, but it also helps that the role is based on the fundamentals of operational warfare.
Let me shift it a little bit. I take the Army part of the M and I split it, and to use some words from Dr. Sheena Greiden, our visiting professor, and we're going to do a podcast on an article that her and a co-author did on traditional and non-traditional security sectors, which is unique in terms of this. Are we in a Cold War 2.0 or are we in the globalization 2.0 World War I problem? Is that we're sort of in the military lane offering the external defense support that's required of our allies and partners. And the Chinese are coming in and providing non-traditional military support to nation states in terms of smart cities and police support and peacekeeping operations and infrastructure development that all ties to some of the ideas that every company in China must share all of its knowledge with the CCP, which means you're undercutting the security. So you've seen some of these discussions about why countries can't get some of the more sophisticated high-tech weapon systems because the military is its own Internet of Things. And our Internet of Things is multiple layers of encryption based on classification levels and access and data points and ports of entry, but it still rides on the commercial backbones in many cases. So it creates undue risk with our allies and partners if they buy too much into the non-traditional security sector of the Chinese that we're trying to hold off. So 5G, smart city grids, and things like that become a challenge. We're providing some of the external military options. Are we missing the boat in terms of providing other options that are required for our allies and partners to maintain peace and security?
Short answer is yes, we're definitely missing the boat. I also want to make sure I mention this. Professor Greiten's work is incredibly valuable to me in both my job as G5 and just my understanding of the strategic dynamics in the region. We are missing the boat in the competition with China. Let's set the table here. China is a global rival. There's only one global rival to the United States today, and that's China. Russia is not a global rival, but China is a global rival. And what that means to me is China's view of competition with us is who's number one and who's number two. So that's critical. I'll go down one level to competition. Competition is certainly a reality. Competition is the medium through which international relations is done. There's nothing especially problematic about competition in and of itself. However, our competition with China is an especially aggressive form of competition. So competition is not same across the board. Essentially, you can have cooperative competition, or you can have this type of aggressive or rivalry-based competition. So our competition with China is this aggressive rivalry-based form. The aggressive competition with China based on a state-to-state, a great power-to-great power rivalry, we are missing the boat. We are not ready, and we need to catch up very, very fast. Now, I don't think I'm saying anything that we don't already know. I do believe that what I've just said walks right into the discussion of are we in a Cold War 2.0 or not? Is it a zero-sum game against China? And also, as you and I have talked about, if we went to war with China, what would that do to China's economy? What would that do to the United States economy? What would that do to the regional and global economy? as you and I understand, even if we went to war with China, there would be no turning off of economies. I still believe even in a war with China, some form of economic activity would continue even between the United States and China. I'll say a level of thinking that we just haven't had to take seriously again for 30 years since the end of the Cold War.
We're going to do a future podcast with you on character and nature of a conflict with a high-end peer. Can you briefly talk about how you see the character of a conflict with China and what the Army should be thinking about in terms of doctrine or force structure, design, modernization, and joint and combined relationships?
Great questions. And of course, there's no way for me to avoid, again, the unique and historic situation that we find ourselves in. As I mentioned in the article, our aggressive rivalry with China is unique. China is an adversary that we face today like no other. This is a historic first. So that makes it difficult to progress through questions like this because you're touching the guardrail of historic events and historic developments. But the character of a war with China, this is incredibly important because this is a mixture of the past and history with the future. So a war with China would not be a repeat of the Pacific War of the Second World War, the 1941-1945 Pacific War. Although, of course, as you know, I'm going to say there are many, many invaluable lessons we can learn from that historical case study. I also recognize that a war with China would have future characteristics that are, frankly, hard to wrap one's head around. The ranges, the persistent stare, the space domain, the information environment, these are truly new horizons. And when you put great power war inside on those new horizons, it is hard to really predict how this would happen. Now, the responsibility to think through with as much detail and clarity as we can the first battle of the first operation of the first campaign of a war with China. After that, I am convinced that things will fundamentally change in ways that we can't predict. So in my war planning terms, I'm always thinking of that first battle of the first operation of the first campaign. After that, it'll really depend on, of course, it sounds unfulfilling to say this, but I still believe it's reality. It'll depend on how all those things play out. Those things will play out in a number of months. After that, internal dynamics of a great power war will take over, and China and the United States, Washington and Beijing, will be pulled into dynamics that we will be reacting to as much as we will be driving. So very hard to say. Back to the character of the first contact. So the first battle will be very destructive. Now, there is a scenario where the first battle is actually almost a phony battle, but I believe that's the outlier. I believe that the more likely character of that first battle is its very high lethality. I say there's going to be a lot of destruction. That doesn't necessarily mean that there will be a lot of human death. And I say that because, again, the internal dynamics of a great power war is I'm always looking at when does the loss of human life reach on the opposing side and on our friendly side, the point where in the Clausewitzian trinity, the powers of the population take over. So in high-tech contemporary warfare, in this first battle, there could be a lot of destruction. It's going to be an unusual first battle if there's a lot of physical destruction. The loss of human life actually appears low because I wonder if that doesn't actually stoke unrealistic flames for more war under the false assumption that loss of human life will continue to stay low, because I don't believe it will stay low. So the character of that first battle, it will be high-tech. It will be a lot of ranged battle. It will not be exclusively outranged, but both sides will exploit a lot of our ranged capabilities, no doubt. But I also believe the outcome of that first battle is going to be very militarily unsatisfying for both sides. So again, I think in terms of what do great powers do when the first battle of their war is so militarily unsatisfying?
One of the things I'm working with Josh Aristegi, our chair of China research, is how does the PLA and the CCP view the character of a conflict against the United States? Because I think that signals a lot more cognitive understanding of what we should be preparing for. From your perspective of working through the idea of strategy planning, war games tied to campaigning across a continuum of conflict, do you think we're looking deep enough into those topics to adequately figure out what type of army and joint force we actually need?
I will go right to the Pacific Army. But I do want to mention again, I always enjoy discussing the PLA with Josh. His expertise is really astounding for understanding of the PLA. I'll go right to the Pacific Army. Of course, we all have in the historical backdrop the Airland Battle Doctrinal Revolution, the Airland Battle Army, the Army of Excellence Organization, all the way up to Desert Storm, the Big Five. And then we come up to today's priority modernization initiatives, Army Futures Command, Project Convergence. We have this all as our backdrop. The question for the leaders, starting with General Flynn out in Hawaii for the Pacific Army, is when do we come together and decide that we actually need a Pacific Army? Now, I want to be clear, the Army is not designed for this. By and large, our Army systems are designed to produce a single Army that is keyed to our single doctrine, which is keyed to our single concept, our future operational concept. The idea is the Indo-Pacific, and especially is the PLA, so unique and the operational problems so extensive that we actually need a Pacific-designed Army. I'm not going to say that there's a foregone conclusion there, but I do believe that it's probably time for the Army to do a dedicated study to this and to figure out, are we on the precipice of needing an Army designed for that theater and that threat? I will say this, General Flynn has said that if we design an Army that can defeat the PLA in general war, nobody likes this terminology, no less me, but that Army will be good enough for other threats and other theaters and potential areas of operation.
That's a cogent thought I think we should eagerly look forward to investigating, and appreciate your deep insights that you're gaining in that job.
With respect to the article, I would ask anybody who reads it, if you have comments, if you have follow-ups, if you have ideas for further study along the same lines, please get in contact with me. But I say this because the fundamental issue is, one, in historic terms, it's staring us in the face. And the salience of the issue of a Sino-American war is not going away anytime soon. I hope that the article spurs people to think more than I have and to get with me for areas that I could follow up on. Thank you, Rich.
Marco, thank you very much, and appreciate the time and energy you're putting into making sure that we are defending our nation properly. This will defend, as we always say. So thank you very much.
For more Army War College podcasts, check out Decisive Point, Conversations on Strategy, and SSI Live.